We are in a series called After God's Heart, where we are seeking to know the heart of God. And we are doing that by looking at stories from the life of David, who God refers to as a man after his own heart. David is someone who we could say is in pursuit of the heart of God. That's one way of thinking about after God's heart. But I think what we're meant to see is that the way that he lives in some ways reflects God's heart. It shows what God values, and it helps us to see the character and nature of God in this man, David. And so we've been in this for a few weeks now, and we saw in the very beginning in the anointing of David, we see a God represented who shines through that story, who sees beyond the surface, who sees deeply into the heart, and he knows what is within us. And so when he loves us to the core. He loves us all the way through, not just based on what is on the surface. We saw a couple of weeks ago the story of David and Goliath, where David stood in the middle of the battlefield as the champion, which literally means the man in the middle. He stood there to face the giant that the rest of the army was too afraid to face. And we see a reflection of Jesus as he stands in the middle and faces the evil that we cannot face. And he emerges victorious, sharing that victory with us. And last week we saw David's relationship, his friendship with Jonathan, and how their souls were woven together, and we see a reflection of how God designed his people to be connected in fellowship and woven together with him and with one another. This week, we find a God in the story of David who is there with us in the hardest seasons of life. David was anointed to the throne when he was a young man, anointed to be the successor to Saul, but the path that God lays out in front of him is not exactly a straight line. And quite often we may experience this too, that the path to the promise regularly passes through the wilderness. And there is a winding, difficult path that leads us to what God is promising. That was certainly true for David. David's life, just shortly after making that covenant of friendship with Jonathan, and how they would look out for one another and have one another's backs, it begins to unravel. And almost overnight, David goes from being this national hero, a general in the army, a son-in-law to the king, the best friend of the prince, to being kind of this homeless fugitive, someone on the run, fleeing for his life because Saul quickly grows jealous and suspicious and paranoid and wants to kill David. And so the season of life that we find David in this morning is one of those that could be described by the phrase desperate times calling for desperate measures. And so as David goes on the run, he goes to a place called Nob. And he goes into the tabernacle there, and he meets with the priest that is there, and he's on the run, and he's able to eat some of the bread from the tabernacle that was sort of set aside as holy. It was the showbread is what it was called. And the priest actually gives David the sword of Goliath that was on display there. He gives it to him for his protection. David leaves there, and he goes, and what's the last place that Saul would look for him? David goes and he hides out among the enemy. He hides out among the Philistines. In fact, he goes to Goliath's hometown of Gath, and he hides out there. But eventually he's recognized. And people know who he is, and so he's got to figure out how to get out of this situation, so he pretends to be insane. And he starts, clawing at the gates, and he's drooling down his beard, and he pretends like he's out of his mind, and the king is just like, get that guy out of here. And so that's how he escapes, and he runs off to a place called, where we pick up today, in the Caves of Adullam. the caves of Adullam. David departed from Gath and he escaped in 1 Samuel 22:1 to the cave of Adullam. There are a lot of caves in this area, in this region, so we have no way of knowing what exactly cave David was in. But here's an example of caves in the region. You can imagine, I put this on the screen for your imagination to kind of be there with David in the cave for a moment. And all that's transpired up to this point, we can imagine David sitting in a cold, damp, limestone cavern. And just imagine him there, alone with his thoughts, wondering, how did it lead to this, and where do we go from here? It's been a while since the oil that Samuel poured on his head had dried up. It's been a while since he was told that he was anointed to be the next king of Israel, and you got to wonder if, even if it was a passing thought, if he wondered, did Samuel make a mistake? This doesn't seem like the path to the throne. Maybe he's replaying his pretending to be insane while he was in Gath, and how he's gone from this person who was the giant slayer to, in that moment, a laughingstock. Maybe he glances over at the sword that the priest at Nob gave him, remembering how he slew Goliath, and maybe laughing to himself about how is this sword supposed to help me now. Maybe he remembers Samuel, his mentor, who was there for him, who had anointed him, and wonders if he'll ever see him again. Samuel is old at this point. Maybe he thinks about his wife, the daughter of Saul, Michal, wondering if he'll see her again. Maybe he thinks about his best friend Jonathan and the covenant that they made with one another. Will there be a chance to honor that covenant? Everyone that he loves, everyone that he knows, everyone that he's been there for and who has been there for him is miles away as he sits in a dark cave by himself, waiting for Saul's boots to make a sound on the ground as he shows up to kill him. Have you ever been in a cave? Maybe not literally. Have you been in a metaphorical cave like this? Maybe you lost a job and you don't know what the next move is. Maybe you experienced the trials of marriage as it fell apart. Maybe you got a health report that didn't look too promising. Maybe you discovered that a friend that you had trusted had stabbed you in the back. Chances are you know what the cave feels like. In one way or another, it feels like we sit amidst the ruins of our life and our plans, and we wonder what to do next. But here's the truth that I want you to know this morning, is that we serve a God who does some of his best work amid the ruins. He is there. And so the first point this morning is when we find ourselves in our lowest, most isolated places, we're going to see from David, God meets us there. When we are at our lowest, God meets us there. He cares about the places that we are in. He cares about those things. He loves us. David may have been, as I described, isolated when he entered that cave, but he was never actually alone. God met him there. And Psalm 142, actually, in your Bible, it probably has a heading on it. In my Bible, it says that it's a maskil of David, and it says, when he was in the cave, a prayer. And so you can imagine this being something that he is praying as he is in that cave. This is something he wrote down from that time. And he says, with my voice, I cry out to the Lord. With my voice, I plead for mercy to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before him. I tell my trouble before him when my spirit faints within me. God, you know my way. When my spirit faints within me, you know my way. And we see David pouring out his heart in lament. The word there that says, when my spirit faints, the word faints, is the Hebrew word ataf. And what it literally means is to be shrouded or veiled, or we might say wrapped in darkness. And so he's saying, my spirit is wrapped up, it is covered, it is wrapped up and it is mourning, it is in this place of darkness. It describes a mental state where the path forward is obscured. And you can't see what's ahead. And you're just not sure what to do next. That's the type of mindset that this describes. The geography of where he is also kind of interesting. It sort of serves as a metaphor for his condition as well. He's in the Caves of Adullam, which is in a region known as the Shephelah. There is, if you can imagine, the coast, the Mediterranean coast to the west. And then you have the coastal plains, that's where the Philistines live. And then you go a little bit further and you have the hill country, the high hill country, that's where Judah is. And in between those two is the Shephelah. It's kind of the foothills and the transitional geography that is there. And that's where he is. And David is himself kind of in the middle. Right? He's kind of in this transitional state. He's gone from the Philistines, but he's not quite back into Judah yet. Where do we go from here? As I said, he laments before the Lord. Lament is not always something that we're good at. People tend to feel like it's somehow more spiritual to just try to find the silver lining and just try to be positive. But there is a place for lament as well, and it is not a lack of faith. In fact, lament, when properly done, is an expression of faith. It is giving our pain and our struggles and those difficulties over to God. It's giving them a place to go before a Lord who can do something about it and who invites us to entrust him with that pain. In fact, somewhere around 40% of the Psalms are laments, or they contain lament within them. 40% is an expression of that pain that gives it somewhere to go to God. Psalm 34 also comes from this time, just after the time when he pretended he was insane among the Philistines. It comes right after that, where it says, David says, when the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears, and he delivers them out of their troubles. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted, and he saves the crushed in spirit. And so that's what I mean when I say when we find ourselves in the lowest places, God meets us there. Because the Lord, David says, and he experiences, the Lord is near to the brokenhearted. And so when David sits in that cave, and when you and I sit in our caves of sorts, know that you are not abandoned by the Lord. He is near, and he is working in those times. God will redeem those experiences for his purposes. When a potter is working a vessel, and God is described as a potter in several places in the scriptures. But when a potter is working a vessel and realizes after it's been formed already that it needs to be reworked, if the clay is too dry, he can't just start shaping it again. It'll just crumble and crack away. And so what he does is he places it in what is called a moisture closet. It's this dark, damp place where over time the clay can get rehydrated so it's workable again. And maybe that's an image of what God may do with us sometimes in placing us in those dark spaces. He's working us, he's preparing us to shape us into what he intends for us to be. David is in such a place. He's in that dark, damp, uncomfortable place where God is shaping. God's at work here. And in fact, it's not long. We only read the first verse so far of the story. It's not long until David has company. God provides David with some people that show up. End of verse 1 and beginning of verse 2. When David's brothers and all his father's house heard of it, they went there to be with him. I don't know how they heard about it. The text doesn't tell us. But somehow they heard where David was, and I believe God brought them together. But it goes on from there. It says, everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was bitter in soul, gathered to David. And he became commander over them, and there were with him about 400 men. And so suddenly in the matter of just a few verses, although I think the time span is a little bit longer than what it took to read it, but these 4 verses describe this guy who goes to this cave alone and laments before God, and then God starts bringing people together. God starts joining together this group of people, not just family to surround him, but others. First his family, and then those who are distressed, those who are in debt, and those who are bitter. Reflect on those words for just a moment. The Hebrew word for that is distressed here is tsar. And it means something, it's describing something that is narrow, something that is squeezed. And you imagine people that are under pressure, that have been squeezed by the life and the society that they've been living in. The rule of Saul has led to them being squeezed from various angles, and they are hurting. They are under pressure and hemmed in. Then those who are in debt. The word is nasha. It describes people who are bankrupt, who have been exploited by creditors, who've been taken advantage of. They've been trapped in an economic system that they couldn't escape. And they didn't know what to do, but they were drawn to David. The third one is bitter. Mar nefesh, which literally means chafed of soul. Chafed of soul is describing a deep internal wound. They are wounded from within. They have been victims of injustice, perhaps, and they have raw emotional scars. This is a rough group. It's been through some difficult things. They've been harmed, I think, by the way that things have gone under the rule of Saul. And God is drawing them together to surround what will become the next king, that will lead them into a better kind of kingdom. And so out of that brokenness, when we find ourselves in the lowest, most isolated places, God will meet us there. And here in the story, out of that brokenness, God draws the wounded and the broken together, and He's shaping. The potter has got his hands in the clay here, shaping and transforming them into a community of grace. He's making a community of people, and I'm reminded of Jesus. And I think we should be. I'm reminded of Jesus and the kinds of people that surrounded him, the kinds of people that were associated with him, that he did his work with. Jesus, whose birth was announced to working class shepherds rather than to the royalty in the palace. Jesus, who gathered, when he started his ministry, he gathered around him some unconventional disciples. Guys who were fishermen and tax collectors and zealots. And he brings these guys together. Who stood on what is known as the Mount of Beatitudes and gave a Sermon on the Mount that started with proclaiming blessings over those who were poor in spirit, those who mourn, and those who are meek, and so forth. Who, as he went about, proclaimed Hey, if you're weary and heavy laden, come to me and I'll give you rest. And so I see a reflection of Jesus, the son of David, in his ancestor David. As the weary come to him. That's always been the way that God has worked, though. He brings together unexpected people. Long before David huddled in a cave with 400 outcasts, God had formed a nation of people to be his treasured possession out of an enslaved people in Egypt. He didn't choose them because they were so impressive either. In fact, as they later on were getting ready to go into the promised land, Moses reminded them in Deuteronomy 7, he says, it's not because you are more in number than any of the other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you, for you are the fewest of all peoples. So you don't think that it's because you're so great. It's because the Lord loves you, and he's keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. He says, remember, don't, and there's several warnings like this in Deuteronomy leading up to them going into the promised land, not to forget who they were. And Paul similarly reminds the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians chapter 1:26. He says, remember, dear brothers and sisters, that few of you were wise in the world's eyes, or powerful or wealthy when God called you. Instead, God chose the things the world considers foolish in order to shame those who think they are wise. And he chose the things that are powerless to shame those who are powerful. He chose the despised things by the world, the things despised by the world, things counted as nothing at all, and used them to bring to nothing what the world considers important. Remember what you were, Paul says. The church is not meant to be just a place for perfect people to show off how perfect they are. Some people have that feeling. That's not what it's meant to be. It is the home of God's powerful grace where broken people come together like a stained glass window to show off how perfect their God is. It's not about showing off how perfect we are. It's about demonstrating the greatness of our God. You know that diamonds, they don't start off the way they look in those display cases at the jewelry store. You know, as they sparkle and glitter in the light behind glass there and have enormous price tags on them. They don't start out that way. They start out in the earth, in the dirt, amidst the rocks that have to be chiseled apart to get to them. And when they come out, they are rough and gray and just look like little rocks. They have to be formed by somebody that is able to see beyond that initial appearance. A master jeweler knows how to look past those rough edges and begin to shape it and polish it until it is something that can sit in the display case with a large price tag. In David's cave, in the Cave of Adullam, there were 400 unpolished diamonds that God knew how to cut and shape and polish. God was working in that cave as he brought that community together. And he's still at work today. And I wonder, what will God do by his grace in our community as we gather together in his name, as we set aside our instincts to try to impress one another, and we set aside masks and all the things that we try to cover up with and be something else, but we just authentically connect and grow together. What will God shape us into? And so God brings these people into David's life, brings David into their life, brings them all together, and God forms this community around David that's going to be there for him as the story goes forward. Those who were hurting could then find support. They could find hope for their future. Those who were crushed under the systems that were in place could look to a better tomorrow. And so David's there with them, and he's in this cave, but he doesn't stay there forever. The story goes on, and he moves on from that place. Because true security, what we're going to see is true security isn't dependent on being in a safe location, but being in a secure relationship with God. So this is how the story goes on. I'll read all this, but we'll mainly just focus on part of it. Verse 3, David went from there, from those caves, to a place called Mizpah of Moab. And he said to the king of Moab, "Please let my father and mother stay with you till I know what God will do for me." I'm going to pause there for a second. He's already, notice how he speaks about these things. Till I know what God will do for me, he's saying, I know God's doing something. I don't know what it is yet, but he's leading me somewhere, and I'm going to find out what it is. And in the meantime, he entrusts his parents to the king of Moab. Side note, why does he take his parents to Moab? Do you remember who David's great-grandmother is? She was a Moabite named Ruth. So maybe there is some family connection still there. Maybe he anticipates that maybe they will take care of his parents well, since they maybe remember that as well. That's a side note. Anyways, he goes on and he says that he moves on from there, and he's going to see what God will do for him. And he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. And so he's gone to a place called the stronghold. We'll come to that in a minute. Then the prophet Gad said to David, "Do not remain in the stronghold. Depart and go into the land of Judah," back to that high hill country. And so David departed, and he went into the forest of Hareth. So after making sure his parents were taken care of, he heads for a place called the stronghold. In Hebrew, the word is Metsudah. And a lot of people think that what it's talking about is this place right here, is a place that is called Masada, which is a variation of the term Metsudah. And so it's not for sure, but generally speaking, this is kind of what people think is the place that we're talking about when David goes to the stronghold, the Metsudah. This is a plateau you can see that is high and surrounded by cliffs all the way around. It is a very defensible place. In fact, it is 1,300 feet above the Dead Sea, and there are cliffs all around it. And it is such a good defensible place that actually many years later, Herod the Great built a palace here. In fact, that's what you can see on the corner of it there. But he built a palace there that there's actually no record of him ever going to. But he built it there so that it could be his kind of backup plan, his kind of place to bug out if a rebellion came up. He could get to Masada and he could stay there and he'd be safe. That's interesting. And in fact, in 70 AD, again, this is much after David, but in 70 AD, when the Romans rolled in and destroyed Jerusalem and all that, there was a group of Jewish zealots who fled to Masada, and they were able to hold out there for a while until the Romans came along, and after months and months of work and engineering, they finally built a siege ramp up to Masada. You can actually still see the siege ramp right there. But they finally were able to take it. It is thought that maybe this is the place where David was when he was talking about the stronghold, the Metsudah. And so the prophet comes along to David and he tells him, "Do not remain in the stronghold. Don't stay there. Instead, leave this place of safety, this defensible position, and go back to Judah." Back to Judah? That's Saul's home turf. That's going straight back into the place of danger. That is leaving this safe space and stepping back into the hunting grounds of a jealous and paranoid king. But I think that we're learning something here too. We're learning that as David seeks refuge, the refuge is not just found in safe spaces. Refuge is found in God himself and doesn't depend on the security of our circumstances. Refuge is found in God himself by commanding David to leave the stronghold. As God sends word to David through his prophet to leave the stronghold, God is saying to him, David, your safety was never the physical strength of your fortress. Your safety is me. If you stay in the stronghold, then you are trusting in your circumstances. But if you step into Judah, you are trusting in my character. And so David is called to leave those walls of safety behind and go back into the danger. And David writes this in Psalm 62. He says, "For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken." And then in verse 5 of the same psalm, he says, "For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence, for my hope is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. On God rests my salvation and my glory. My mighty rock, my refuge is God." And I just think that, I showed you that picture of Masada because I really think that these words land a little differently when you're picturing the rocks that he was hiding among. And he says, all of this that serves to protect people, actually my rock, my fortress, my place where I'm going to be safe is in God. And God was teaching him that as he called him to leave that fortress behind. But notice his emphasis on God alone and he only. A lot of times when we are in those difficult spots, our thoughts and prayers amid the challenges often center around changing the circumstances. And that's okay to pray. I mean, we can bring those things to God and ask God to change the circumstances, sure. But what if, at the same time, we changed our mindset that our security didn't depend on the circumstances changing? That we could be secure, we could seek refuge in God even in the midst of unchanging circumstances. What, for you, what's your stronghold? What's your Metsuda? What's the place where you seek a sense of security? Maybe it's looking at the number on the bank account or investments, and that makes you feel more secure. It's a financial insulation, where you can accumulate enough to buffer against life's volatility. Now, don't hear me saying something I'm not. Good stewardship, wise planning is a good and biblical thing. What I'm challenging you to consider is, what is your posture towards it? Is it what God has given me to use as tools for his kingdom? And what will happen to me and my sense of security if that's wiped out tomorrow? Will I still rest in security with him? What's your Metsuda? Is it relational withdrawal? Maybe you distance yourself from other people or keep others at an arm's length because people have hurt you before, and so you go into kind of an emotional fortress, finding safety in the isolation. Can the story challenge you to step out of that comfort? To step into the vulnerability of the community that God provides? What's your Metsuda? Is it a sense of trying to control things in life? of wanting to manage every detail of your life and maybe your spouse's life and maybe your kid's life and whatever you can do to try to manufacture some result out of it that you can be in control of and you know what's going to happen. I'm going to be honest with you. I can relate to all three of these examples that I've given. These can be the tempting fortresses that we can seek security within. But what if they're taken away? Can we be secure in God Himself? Can He be our rock? Can He be our fortress? Can He be our refuge? Seek Him. When a storm hits a valley, most birds fly away to find some sort of hollow tree or a cave or something that they can hide in. But the eagle behaves differently. It sets its wings toward the wind, and it uses the very fury of the storm to give it lift to rise above those clouds. The eagle doesn't find a refuge to get away from the storm. It uses its God-given design to rise above it. I see an image of what God can do in us as well. God didn't want David to just be hiding in a physical stronghold. He wanted David to set the wings of his faith toward the crisis that he was in and discover that the winds of adversity would just lift him up higher and higher and closer to his God. When David was in that cave, in that difficult time of life, which he's going to move through. We're going to find him going all the way to the throne. You can imagine it feeling like the end of the story. Sometimes it feels that way when challenges arise, when we go through periods of what we might call tribulation. It can feel like the end of the story. David's story was not over. And yours isn't either. You're still here this morning. The story's still going. We still press on. Our greater David, our Jesus, he was in a cave of his own. He was laid in a cave tomb after his execution, but he emerged from that cave, from that tomb, victorious over sin and death. His story, despite all appearances, was not over. And when we are in him, neither is ours. He established his kingdom among the distressed, among the indebted, among the deeply wounded, and he brings new life to us all. And he invites us into this community of grace, to be joined together in God's family in what we know as the church. So this morning, if you are in a season kind of like David's cave, don't cling to false strongholds as your hope. Find the true refuge in the shadow of his wings. Come and be loved, as our theme is for the year. Come and be loved by Jesus. And know the refuge amid the ruins that he provides. This morning, we want you to know that we are here for you. We are a family that prays for one another, that takes care of one another. And if you have needs this morning, if anything I've said this morning has resonated with you and you need somebody to pray with and be there for you, we want to do that for you. During this next song that we're going to sing, I'll be at the back of the room with the elders, and we invite you to reach out. If you are ready to put on Jesus in baptism and come follow him, we would love to baptize you today. If you need anything at all, we are here for you during this next song and after service too. But let's conclude this morning by going back once again to Psalm 62, the words of David, where he says, "On God rests my salvation and my glory, my mighty rock, my refuge is God. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us." If we can be there for you this morning, would you please reach out as we stand and sing?